welcome to the respiratory system video. So this is the respiratory system. We think of the lungs and the airways as making it up. Its primary function is bringing air to the lungs for gas exchange. And if we look at the lungs, they're divided into these tiny sacs called alveoli. And because they're so curled up, if we were to unfold all those, the lungs would actually have a huge surface area of about 100 square meters, which is about the size of a tennis court. And they have that huge surface area so that they can they have lots of rooms to exchange gas there. The upper respiratory system consists of basically the tubes that bring air to the lower respiratory system. So the nose, the mouth, the larynx, and then in the upper respiratory system, the air is warmed, it's moistened, and it's filtered. So that way our lungs are happier if they get warm, moist, clean air. And then the lower respiratory system consists of the smallest airways and the alveoli. Here's the alveoli down here. Now, inspired air is filtered in the nose and the trachea, and pathogens and debris are trapped in the mucus, and then they're removed. These cilia move, and they move that stuff up and out of the lungs. And here we can see even closer the cilia. And the nasal cavity and the trachea are lined with this ciliated epithelium. And we can see here the mucus producing cells, and then these cilia, their job is to move the mucus out. So if we look at the tissue that makes up the lungs again, in the nose we have the ciliated epithelium. Also we have that in the trachea and most of the airways, and that's for moving things out. Dirt and bad things get caught in the mucus, and then the cilia move it out. If we look at the pharynx right here, it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium for protection. That's because this area serves two purposes. Both air comes through it, and also we eat, so it needs to be tough for the swallowing, and the food goes down the esophagus here. In the smaller bronchioles, so once we get down here, the smaller bronchioles, it becomes simple cuboidal epithelium, and then in the smallest level in the alveoli, it becomes simple squamous epithelium, which is good for diffusion. This is showing a person with cystic fibrosis, and with cystic fibrosis, it's a problem with the ion channel, and it causes a very dense mucus that cannot be moved. And this can be a place for bacteria to grow, and that's how they get infections. If we look at a coronal slice through the head at the level of the nose, we will see these weird looking spiral things. These are the concha. The concha are there to increase the surface area for filtration in the nasal cavity, so the air can move in any of this area, but the whole thing is coated with mucus and that ciliated epithelium, so hopefully any air that goes through there, you can see it's not far from a surface that's going to be coated with mucus, so it's going to be cleaned. And if we look at a side view, this is what the concha look like. The larynx is the next place air will go. The larynx protects the glottis, and it also produces sound. So here's a side view, and we can see in here is the vocal ligaments, and this is the glottis right here. It's kind of the opening to the trachea, And we can see the vocal folds here. Here it is open, and on the right it is closed. And that is how we produce sound. This view, we can see the epiglottis here. It's a flexible flap, and it will fold back, and it covers the glottis during swallowing. Okay, this is the trachea, and it divides into a left and right primary bronchi. These provide an air passageway to the lungs. If we look at a cross-section through the trachea, the front part of it is made of the tracheal cartilage. They're called tracheal rings, or sometimes cartilage rings, or just C rings. And in the back there's this trachealis muscle. It's a smooth muscle. The rings make the trachea very strong, but it is also a little bit flexible. And as air enters the body, enters the lungs, it's going to go through first the trachea, then the primary bronchi, and then these branch into secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi branch into tertiary bronchi, and then if it gets smaller than that, we just call it bronchioles. It branches an average of 17 times before it gets down to the smallest thing, so that would get really confusing. So after a tertiary bronchi, if it's smaller than that, we just call it a bronchiole. And then terminal bronchioles are right before the alveoli. And the alveoli, that's where the gas exchange actually happens. If we look at the larger airways, they contain cartilage, and the smaller airways, like the bronchioles, they have a layer of smooth muscle. That smooth muscle allows us to control their diameter. So if we want to breathe more, we'll relax those smooth muscles so more air can go through. If we look at the lungs, here's a drawing of the lungs. And we can see the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung only has 2 lobes, and it has this little cardiac notch. That's because the heart is located in the middle, and it takes up some of the room that the left lung would take. Here are some real lungs, so we can see we're not making this up. On the right side there's 2 lobes, on the left side there's 3 on the right side, 2 on the left side, 1, 2, and on the left side there's the inferior, middle, and superior lobe. And this shows the medial surfaces of the lungs. Well, on top is the lateral, and on bottom is medial, and here we can see this is the place where the heart would go. So that's why the left lung only has 2 lobes. And so again, we can see air has to go through the trachea, bronchi, then the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, and then down to the alveoli. And gas exchange actually occurs in the alveoli, way down here. And you can see there's lots of blood vessels going to the alveoli because they go there to get their oxygen. This figure also shows us the pleura around the lungs. The visceral pleura covers the lungs, and this pleural cavity contains fluid that reduces friction. So then the parietal pleura is it covers the chest cavity, and this allows us to inflate or deflate our lungs without causing friction. If we look at a close-up, extreme close-up on the alveoli, this is what we would see. The different cells here, we have these type 2 pneumocytes. They secrete what's called surfactant. Surfactant is a fluid that reduces the surface tension in the alveoli. It's one of the last things you start making before you're born, and it used to be a problem with premature babies, but now we can make artificial surfactant and help those premature babies. Also in the lungs we will see these macrophages. they phagocytize anything foreign, so hopefully all the dirt got trapped in the mucus and didn't make it to the lungs, down to the alveoli, but if something did, these macrophages would swallow it and get rid of it. And we can see there are blood vessels surrounding the alveoli if we look even closer. So this is the alveoli here, this is that blood vessel, and right here we have what's called the respiratory membrane. So it's made up of the alveolar epithelium, which is this from the lung tissue. There's a basal lamina which connects the alveolar epithelium to the endothelium from the capillary. And this can be as thin as 0.1 micrometers. That is 1/10,000th of a millimeter, so that is super small. The average width is about 0.5 micrometers though, which is still super tiny. Okay, let's look at the processes of respiration. There's 4 things that have to happen. And the first one is pulmonary ventilation. That's the fancy word for breathing. That's moving air in and out of the lungs, and we have to constantly do that because otherwise we'll run out of oxygen. Then the next process is external respiration. This is the gas exchange in the lungs. It's inside our body, but it's external because our lungs are actually exposed to the outside. And then we have gas diffusion happening and transport happening. That's getting the blood to the tissues, so we learned about the heart and the blood vessels. They take care of the transport for us. And then we have internal respiration, which is gas exchange at the tissues. So during external respiration, it's mainly oxygen going into the blood and carbon dioxide leaving the blood. And at the tissues, you have the opposite happening. You have oxygen leaving the blood and carbon dioxide entering the blood. But we'll look at those processes more closely later on. And we have a question for you. The process by which dissolved gases are exchanged between the blood and interstitial fluid is... And interstitial fluid would be in the tissues, so that is called internal respiration. That's at the tissues. Alright, pulmonary ventilation is driven by pressure changes in the pleural cavities. And those pressure changes, that's what moved blood through the heart, and that's also what moves air through the lungs. And we need to understand Boyle's Law. This figure shows us Boyle's Law. It says that pressure and volume are inversely related. And we can look at these are air molecules, and they're randomly moving. It's called Brownian motion, and everything does it. So if they're in this container, they're randomly moving, they're showing it's going to bounce off the wall 4 times, and that's going to create a certain amount of pressure. Actually 5 times, and that creates a certain amount of pressure. If we decrease the volume, now that same air molecule, since it's more tightly packed in here, it's going to bounce off the wall more times and create more pressure. However, if we increase the volume, the air molecules are more spread out and they're going to bounce into the wall fewer times, and we have less pressure. So that's Boyle's Law. And we use that to our advantage. It's hard to change the pressure in our lungs, but it's easy to change the volume in our lungs. We do that by moving the diaphragm. That's this muscle right here, and it can go from this position, and when it contracts, it moves out. And the rib cage, we can also change the rib cage using our external and internal intercostal muscles. So as we elevate the rib cage, that increases the volume. So moving the diaphragm and the rib cage, we change the volume of the thoracic cavity. And the lungs, they stick to the thoracic wall due to the pleural fluid that's in there. That keeps them adhering to the thoracic wall, so when the thoracic wall moves, the lungs move with it. So when we change the volume of the thoracic cavity, we change the volume of the lungs. Now, air always moves from high pressure to low pressure, just like diffusion. Things will go from a high concentration to a low concentration. Things will move from high pressure to low pressure just because there's less energy there. Now, when the pressures inside and outside the lungs are equal, air is not going to flow. But this picture shows us inhalation and exhalation. So on the left we have inhalation. During inhalation, the lung volume increases, and due to Boyle's law, that means the pressure decreases, and that's going to cause air to flow in, because now the pressure in the lungs is lower than the pressure in the atmosphere, so air will flow in. During exhalation, the lung volume decreases, so that means the pressure increases, and air is going to flow out of the lungs because now the pressure in the lungs is higher than the pressure in the atmosphere. So again, we can see during inhalation, the lung volume increases, and that makes a lower pressure. This is measuring the pressure here in the pleural cavity. So during inhalation, that pressure goes down, and we bring air into the lungs. This top figure shows the volume of air in the lungs. And then when we exhale, the pressure in that pleural cavity goes up, and that causes air to flow out of the lungs. This shows the muscles that are important for breathing. The diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles are the primary inspiratory muscles, and then these other muscles are accessory, either inspiratory or expiratory muscles. And this shows how they work. So when we breathe in, the diaphragm, when it contracts, it actually moves down, and the external intercostals are going to lift the rib cage up, so that increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. And then when they relax, that's going to decrease the volume. This chart shows all the different lung volumes. The one you need to know is the tidal volume, which is this one right here. Tidal volume is the amount of air we breathe in and out during normal breathing. We're not going to worry about all these other volumes. So a question, what term refers to the amount of air moved in or out of the lungs during quiet respiration, quiet or normal breathing? That would be the tidal volume. Okay, so this shows a graph of respiratory rate, the number of breaths taken each minute. And our pulmonary ventilation is closely regulated to meet our tissue oxygen demands. It can increase 50 times during strenuous exercise, so the amount of air we bring in and out of our lungs when we're at rest is not that much, but if we're like running a marathon, it can increase up to 50 times. And we can change the amount of air that's coming in by changing either the respiratory rate or by changing the volume of air that is moved with each breath. So we can breathe faster, or we can breathe deeper, or usually we do a combination of both. We'll breathe faster and deeper when we're exercising, and when we're resting, we'll breathe slower and shallower. So respiratory rate is the number of breaths per minute. So that you can just watch someone breathing and figure out their respiratory rate. Some other things we need to know are the respiratory minute volume. That tells us the volume of air moved each minute. And we figure that out by taking the breaths per minute, which we would just measure by looking at someone, and then the tidal volume. And the tidal volume we would need some special equipment to measure. So let me give you an example of this just in case you see a problem like this on your test. So find the respiratory minute volume if the respiratory rate is 12 and the tidal volume is 500. So my respiratory rate, that's breaths per minute, that's 12, and the tidal volume is 500. I just have to multiply those, and you get 6,000 milliliters or 6 liters per minute, which is about average. And so we can see changing the respiratory rate or the tidal volume will affect our respiratory minute volume, which is the volume of air moved each minute. Now, that's not quite accurate because not all the air that we breathe in makes it to the alveoli for gas exchange. We have what's called dead space. The air in the trachea and all the bronchioles we breathe it in, but it doesn't actually get used by our lungs. So to get a more accurate measure of how much air actually makes it to our lungs and is used for gas exchange, we can figure out the alveolar ventilation. It's similar to the respiratory minute volume, but we take away the anatomic dead space to get an idea of how much air is actually going to our lungs. So again, it's the breaths per minute, but it's multiplied by the tidal volume minus the anatomic dead space. And again, we would need some special equipment to measure those. So let's look at an example using that. So now find the alveolar ventilation if the respiratory rate is 12, tidal volume is 500 milliliters, and the anatomic dead space is 150 milliliters. So we just plug those numbers in, and it's going to be, so that will be 350 times 12. And you get 4,200 milliliters per minute. So that's less than the respiratory minute volume, but that's how much air is actually getting to the alveoli and can be used for gas exchange. So let's try another problem. Now find the respiratory minute volume if the respiratory rate is 20 and the tidal volume is 300 milliliters. So this would be the situation if you were breathing rapid shallow breaths, like if you were hyperventilating. And so going back to this equation, 20 times 300 is going to give us 6 liters. So by breathing more rapidly but with shallow breaths, we're not actually changing the respiratory minute volume. Okay, so now we're going to find the alveolar ventilation if the respiratory rate is 20, the tidal volume is 300, and the anatomic dead space is 150. So we would go back to this equation. So tidal volume, it said, was 300, and the anatomical dead space was 150, so I'm going to subtract that and get 150. And then I multiply that by the breaths per minute, which we said was 20. So 150 times 20. And we get 3,000. So when we're doing rapid shallow breaths, our respiratory minute volume didn't change that much, but our alveolar ventilation went way down. It went from 4,200 to 3,000. So that's why rapid shallow breathing is not good. I mean, sometimes we do it, but if we want to get more air, if we want to increase our alveolar ventilation, then slower, deeper breaths are better. Okay, that's enough of these problems. Next, let's talk about gas diffusion. Gas diffusion depends on partial pressures and the solubilities of gases. So this is showing what's in our normal air It's about 78.6% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, very little carbon dioxide, and 0.5% water vapor. So that's the air you're breathing in. By the time it gets to your alveoli, little less nitrogen, a little less oxygen, a lot more carbon dioxide, and also a lot more water vapor, because remember, in the upper respiratory system we are going to moisturize that air. And then the air we breathe out, we can see the oxygen actually goes up, carbon dioxide goes down, and again water vapor. And the point of all this is to teach you about partial pressure. Partial pressure is the pressure contributed by a single gas in a mixture of gases. So the first number is showing the partial pressure of these. And Dalton's law tells us that all the partial pressures added together would equal the total pressure exerted by the gas mixture. So if you were to add all these up, you'd get about 760, which is our normal atmospheric pressure. The next law we need to know is Henry's law. Henry's law says the amount of a particular gas in solution is directly proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. So if there's more of a gas, there's going to be more of the gas in the solution. And we've probably all drank soda at some point. So when soda's put in a can at high pressure, the carbon dioxide goes into solution because there's high pressure. That's what's illustrated here. That gas will go into the solution, and that's why our soda is fizzy. When you open that can, now you're opening it up to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is huge relative to that can. So now the pressure outside has really decreased, so that gas is going to leave, and that's why after a while your soda goes flat. So that's Henry's law. And we need these to understand why gas moves. So this shows us external respiration in the alveoli. And in the alveoli, the PO2 is about 100. So PO2 is partial pressure of oxygen. So that's basically the amount of oxygen in that mixture of gases. And the PCO2, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, is 40. And then the rest of the gas is probably nitrogen. But then if we look at the blood that's entering the alveoli, it has a PO2 of 40 and a PCO2 of 45. So oxygen is going to go down its pressure gradient from 100 to 40. So oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going to go from 45 to 40. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. And then we see the blood leaving the alveoli has the same PO2s as inside the alveoli, because it's in there long enough to reach equilibrium. In the tissues, down here it's showing what's going on at the tissues. The PO2 is about 40 and the PCO2 is 45 because the cells are using up all the oxygen and they're producing carbon dioxide. And the entering blood has a PO2 of about 100 and a PCO2 of about 40. It's going to lose some oxygen along the way. So at the tissues, now oxygen is diffusing out of the blood, and CO2 diffuses from the tissues into the blood. So kind of the opposite of what happened at the lungs. And most of this gas, this is hemoglobin, and 98.5% of the oxygen in the blood is transported by hemoglobin. This figure shows the this shows the amount of time that blood spends in the pulmonary capillaries and how long it takes it to be saturated with oxygen. So it comes into the alveoli with a PO2 of about 40. And because of the thinness of the respiratory membrane and this very steep concentration gradient, you can see the blood is saturated in about 0.25 seconds, and it's in the lungs for about 0.75 seconds. So that means even if we increased our breathing rate 3 times, so say your normal respiratory rate is 15 breaths per minute, when you're exercising that might go up to 45 breaths per minute. But even if our breathing rate goes up, the blood is going to have less time in the capillaries. But even if our breathing rate increases by 3 times, that's still enough time to get the blood saturated with oxygen. So speaking of hemoglobin, this is called an oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, and it shows the percentage of heme units that have oxygen bound. So with a PO2 of 0, none of the hemoglobin is going to be bound. With a PO2 of 100, it's pretty close to 100%. We can see that hemoglobin is 90% saturated at a PO2 of about 60, so that's well below the normal value in the lungs. So even if something goes wrong and we're not getting the full amount of oxygen that we need in our lungs, we'll still be okay. And that's one of the reasons we can hold our breath. After traveling through the systemic circuit, the blood is usually still about 75% saturated. So it could circulate through our body about 4 times before it ran out of oxygen. That's another reason we can hold our breath. And this right here is what we call the physiologically relevant range. That's about what we're going to experience in the tissues. And the slope is very steep there, meaning a small change in PO2 is going to cause a big change in the oxygen saturation. Okay, the PO2 in very active tissues can be as low as 15, so that means more oxygen will be delivered to these tissues because the slope is so steep. Even though the same amount of blood is flowing, because the concentration is different, the concentration difference is greater, more blood would flow into those tissues. There's some things that can affect this curve though, and one of those is pH, and this is called the Bohr Effect. If the pH decreases, we can see here, like what happens in active muscle as lactic acid starts to build up, we say the curve shifts to the right, which means it's going to be easier for the hemoglobin to get rid of oxygen. So that allows more oxygen to go to the tissues that need it. Another thing that will affect it is the temperature. So if the temperature increases, as in active muscle, again the curve shifts to the right, and hemoglobin is going to release more oxygen. Another thing that can affect this curve is a compound called BPG, bisphosphoglycerate, and you find this in people that live at high altitudes, and it will cause hemoglobin to release more oxygen. Alright, an increase in temperature would do what to hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen? And an increase in temperature is going to decrease hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Affinity is how attracted it is. For example, I have an affinity for ice cream because I'm very attracted to ice cream. And if we look back at this figure, we see that shifted it to the right, meaning not as much oxygen is bound at the same PO2 depending on the temperature. So if we increase the temperature, we would be decreasing hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, and that allows more oxygen to go to the tissues that need the oxygen. Alright, now we're going to talk about how carbon dioxide is transported. So oxygen is mainly carried by the hemoglobin. With carbon dioxide it's a little bit different. Actually, about 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions. 23% of carbon dioxide is carried bound to hemoglobin, and about 7% of it is dissolved in the blood plasma. So the way this works is when carbon dioxide enters a red blood cell, there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is going to convert it into carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And then inside the blood cell, it's going to split into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions will bind to hemoglobin, and the bicarbonate will leave the cells. So here's showing what's happening at the tissues. Carbon dioxide enters the blood cell, carbonic acid is formed, then it splits into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Hydrogen binds to the hemoglobin, and the bicarbonate leaves the cell. And in order to keep the electrical balance in the shell, chloride enters the cell, and that's known as the chloride shift. And oxygen entering the tissues, so oxygen entering the tissues is shown here, that's always balanced by the oxygen entering the lungs. And carbon dioxide entering the blood, what we see here happening at the tissues, is always balanced by carbon dioxide leaving the blood at the lungs. Alright, what is the normal hemoglobin saturation in blood leaving the lungs? And blood leaving the lungs is almost 100% saturated. Alright, next we're going to talk about some lung disorders or pulmonary diseases. They affect elasticity and airflow. So one thing that gets affected is the compliance. Compliance is basically the elasticity and the resiliency of the lungs. There's a lot of elastic tissue in lungs, making them very elastic, and they have to inflate and deflate. And then another thing affecting the lungs is the resistance. A higher resistance makes it harder to get air into the lungs. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, you've probably heard of, or COPD. It's a progressive disorder of the airways that restricts airflow, and because of that it reduces the alveolar ventilation. So we learned with blood vessels that if you decrease the diameter, you're going to increase the resistance. The same thing applies to the lungs. So if the airways are blocked, or if they're smaller, that's going to increase the resistance and make it harder to get air into the lungs. This is an individual with asthma, and asthma causes the smooth muscles around the bronchioles to constrict, and so this is going to decrease the diameter of the airways. Also, the mucosa swells and produces more mucus. This increases the resistance, and I used to have asthma. I guess I still do, but when I was a kid I'd have asthma attacks and feel like I was dying. Not fun. But that inhaler, what it is a smooth muscle relaxer, so it relaxes those smooth muscles, opens up the bronchioles, and makes it so you can breathe again. Chronic bronchitis, it's long-term inflammation and swelling of the bronchioles that leads to overproduction of mucus, which increases the resistance, makes it harder to get air into the lungs, and that's why they're always coughing. This is an x-ray of an individual with emphysema, and normally we would see some stuff in the lungs here, but this person's look pretty black. Emphysema is caused by destruction of the alveolar surfaces, and that reduces the surface area for gas exchange. So if you destroy your alveoli, you can't be exchanging gas there. This causes shortness of breath and also the inability to tolerate physical exertion. So that's one of the problems with smoking, and we'll talk more about smoking in a bit. Alright, the elasticity and resilience of the lungs is called, and the correct answer is compliance. Alright, now we're going to talk about how we control breathing. We generally don't think about breathing, it happens automatically. And there are 3 levels of subconscious respiratory control. So the first level's in the medulla, higher levels in the pons, and then even higher levels in the cortex, the limbic system, and the hypothalamus. So we can control our breathing somewhat. We can take a deep breath, or we can increase our breathing rate. We can make ourselves hyperventilate if we want. But normally it's taken care of automatically for us. So let's start with the medulla oblongata. It contains the respiratory rhythmicity centers that set the rate of respiration. And there are 2 groups, the dorsal group, or the DRG. It contains the inspiratory center, and this functions in every respiratory cycle. It sends signals to the diaphragm and the external intercostals, and causing them to contract, and then we breathe. And then we have the VRG, the ventral respiratory group. It functions when ventilation demands increase, and it sends signals to inspiratory and expiratory muscles. Then in the pons, we have what are called apneustic centers. The apneustic centers in the pons promote inhalation by stimulating the dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG. Okay, so the pneumotaxic centers in the pons inhibit the apneustic centers, and they increase respiratory rate. A decrease in pneumotaxic output would slow the respiratory rate, but it increases the depth of respiration because the apneustic centers are more active. So that would make us breathe slower and deeper. And then the higher centers in the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the hypothalamus, they can change the activity of the pneumotaxic centers. So let's look at what these actually do during quiet breathing. During quiet breathing, the dorsal respiratory group, the DRG, stimulates the inspiratory muscles, causing inhalation. So it becomes active, sends a signal to the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. They contract, and we inhale. When these neurons become inactive, the inspiratory muscles relax, and then we exhale. So that's our normal quiet breathing. Then during forced breathing, the DRG stimulates the inspiratory muscles, and the VRG stimulates the accessory inspiratory muscles. So our inhalation is going to be longer and deeper. And then expiratory centers in the VRG activate accessory expiratory muscles. So exhalation is faster and deeper. And we have several respiratory reflexes that provide automatic adjustments in pulmonary ventilation. We'll talk about each one of these. But first, a question: which of these would trigger passive exhalation? And passive exhalation would be during quiet breathing. And the correct answer would be inactivity of the DRG. So when it relaxes, that causes the primary inspiratory muscles to relax, and we exhale. Alright, let's look at some of these reflexes that adjust our respiratory rates. So the most important one is the Chemoreceptor Reflex, and it's activated by PCO2 levels, so the amount of carbon dioxide. we can measure the amount of oxygen too, but usually it's the amount of carbon dioxide that causes problems and affects our breathing. So if we have higher than normal PCO2 levels, that's known as hypercapnia. That's going to stimulate the respiratory muscles and increase the respiratory rate, so we get rid of more carbon dioxide and get back to homeostasis. If we have lower than normal PCO2 levels, that's known as hypocapnia. That will inhibit the respiratory muscles and decrease our respiratory rate, and that will leave more time for carbon dioxide to build up in our bodies and get the level back to normal. Then we also have baroreceptor reflexes. When blood pressure falls, our respiratory rate is going to go up to compensate for that. And when blood pressure goes up, our respiratory rate decreases to compensate for that. Then we also have some reflexes dealing with pressure in the lungs. The inflation reflex prevents overexpansion of the lungs by inhibiting the DRG and stimulating the expiratory centers in the VRG. That keeps our lungs from getting too full. We don't want them to pop. We also have a deflation reflex. It inhibits the expiratory centers and activates the inspiratory centers in the DRG and the VRG. Then we have some protective reflexes. Sneezing and coughing are protective reflexes caused by irritation of the nasal cavity, the larynx, the trachea, or the bronchi. When we sneeze or cough, the air can leave the larynx at 99 miles per hour, carrying foreign particles and irritating gases out of the respiratory tract. So, which of these is the most important factor in regulating respiration? And the most important factor is actually the blood PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Because that's the first thing that's going to go wrong, is the carbon dioxide levels are going to get too high, and that's going to make us increase our breathing rate to compensate for that. Or if carbon dioxide levels get too low, we will decrease our breathing rate. Okay, this chart shows our age and respiratory performance. So starting at age 25, it considers that our peak respiratory performance, and it just goes down. The blue line shows somebody that never smoked, and the red line shows someone that a regular smoker. And we can see that some of the effects of smoking are reversible. But the reason that our respiratory function decreases, it's due to the elastic tissue deteriorating, reducing the compliance in our lungs, makes it harder for them to stretch out, so it just makes it a little bit harder to breathe. And we can see here smoking definitely decreases respiratory performance. So next we're going to talk about lung cancer, because about 12% of cancer cases are lung cancer, and the mortality rate from that is very high, and it's completely preventable. Well, usually. Not all lung cancer comes from smoking. Okay, so this figure shows the events in lung cancer developing. So this is normal tissue right here. We have nice looking cilia and these mucus producing cells, and any dirt or bad things will get trapped in the mucus and moved out of the lungs. When you smoke, those cilia die, and then it also damages the cells. When carcinogens, which there's lots of carcinogens in smoke, when those reach the epithelial cells, they can damage them. So lung cancer forms when epithelial cells are damaged by carcinogens. The first phase is called dysplasia. That's when the cilia are damaged and the cells lose their function, so now they can't move this mucus out, and that's why smokers have that nasty cough. The next phase is called metaplasia. This is when these damaged tissues change their structure and become stratified, and they start dividing out of control. So at this point, this is reversible if you stop smoking. Once these cells start to divide out of control, it's harder. It can be reversed, but it's harder. But then the last step is neoplasia. That's when damaged cells form cancerous tumors. And once you've formed a tumor, that's not reversible. It's too late. And then the last phase is called anaplasia or metastasis. That's when the cancer cells spread out to other tissues.